So I grew up a Christian, and then I was an atheist, and then I was a witch, and this is going to be part one of the story of how I ultimately ended up reverting to Islam. I took my Shahada a little over a week ago, and I am so happy. I have never felt this much peace, but it is a long and involved and difficult story. And so I just want to say that if you are not grown, please run this story by your parents before you watch it. There are just definitely parts that are not friendly for people who are not grown, okay? I'm not trying to be mean. Please run it by your parents. So anyway, I was born into a Christian church, and throughout this story, I want to make it clear that the Christianity that I experienced, when I speak on it, I am specifically speaking on the church that I grew up in and on what I experienced. I'm not generalizing everybody. This also doesn't apply to the family and friends who are still in my life, who are still very devout Christians. Like, mommy, I am not talking about you. You are a beautiful and pure spirit, so this is not about you, okay? But anyway, growing up, I feel like I always heard about God's love, God's love, God's love, and I never seemed to see it from the members of the church. I saw a lot of performative faith, I saw a lot of gossip, I saw a lot of power struggles, and I saw a lot of judgment. And something that became just very clear to me over the years was that while on the surface women were respected, when you scratched that surface even a little bit, there was a very dark undercurrent of how women were considered and treated. And to add on to all of that, I am neurodivergent, and I am also a questioner, and I was always an outcast. Always. Now, all of this came to a head when I had just graduated high school. I was 18 years old. My father had a very, very public affair. I mean, he brought this woman into our home. He brought her to family events and introduced her as his friend, but the vibes were very obvious. It was extremely disrespectful to our family, extremely disrespectful to my mother. And on top of all of that, he was drinking a lot, and he would us, my siblings and myself. And those were very extremely dark days. I remember begging my mother to divorce him. And she finally did, which was incredibly brave of her for her situation, her generation, her culture. And do you remember how I said that when you scratched the surface at the church, the way women were treated was just awful? So even knowing the full story, the church cast my mother out for divorcing my father and for failing to forgive him. And then because I supported her, I also became an outcast. Not long after that, I went to college and I started taking anthropology classes. I had no idea what anthropology was, but the name sounded cool. My entire life at this church, I had been told things like that the earth was 6,000 years old, that dinosaurs weren't real and their bones were just placed on earth by Satan to confuse us. You know, it just seemed like everything that came up as a scientific discovery was some kind of science conspiracy, and I believed that. And in college, taking anthropology, seeing the history of human evolution laid out and all of the evidence, the ample evidence, I was enraged. I felt like I had been lied to my entire life. I had been lied to my entire life. And when you combine that with the pain of being cast out of the church that I had gone to since I was 5 days old for something that was not my fault, that I didn't do, I left. I became an atheist completely. And more than that, I mean, I became a nihilist, which is really centered around everything is meaningless, God is dead, like, we are all nothing. And I walked around with so much rage and pain for so many years. But I always felt this little spiritual pull. Just a little spiritual pull, just a little tugging. So, following that pull, I began to engage in mysticism, Buddhism, like spellcraft and witchcraft, which I think gets a bad rep. It's really like, for me, it was really like lighting candles and burning incense, and it was like focused meditation. And nothing really gave me peace. Like, I think a lot of these practices made me feel better. Like, they were good hobbies. It was like doing yoga for me. Like, it felt good, but it did not fill me up, if that makes sense. And I still classified and considered myself an atheist, even though I was dabbling in spirituality and that kind of thing, because atheism was the only thing I could prove. And I had become and I still am, a very staunch advocate against religious indoctrination. Because it's not a good feeling to realize that you've been lied to your entire life. And I feel like over the years I had sort of started to heal, but it always felt like something wasn't quite right, something wasn't quite clicking. There was that hole, there was that tugging. And then we come to the year 2020, which was the worst year of my life. And I didn't even put all of the details of that terrible, terrible year in my last version of this. So at the time I was working online as an English teacher for kids in China. And as we all know, a lovely illness came around and my job went completely belly up. And then the next thing you know, the entire world is on lockdown. And I managed to get like a temporary position in an office for like 4 hours a day. And so that was barely getting me through, but it was getting me through. Then, without any warning, which I had been promised that I would be given at least a couple weeks' notice, or even given the opportunity to apply for the position I was temping in, without any warning, they told me, oh, it's going to be your last week, we hired somebody. So that was devastating. Now, the same week that happened, the same week that I found out that I was losing my only income, I was brutally SA'd by a man. And I'm having a hard time making eye contact with the screen here, but when I say brutally, I mean that I almost did not survive that experience. And I have a tendency to trauma dump this story, so I'm going to try not to do that, and I'm not going to give details. But I was very lucky to be alive. I was humiliated. It was horrific. And I'm only sharing this part because it's an important detail, but he had added something to what I was drinking. And unfortunately, it did not make me sleep. It just made me paralyzed. Completely unable to move. And if you know, you know. But if you haven't experienced being completely unable to move your body to defend yourself while something terrible is happening, that is not something I would wish on anybody. Sorry, I had to take a moment. Like I said, that part was an important detail. So I was completely broken apart. I was responsible. I took medication to make sure that nothing resulted from that. But I couldn't bring myself to go to an ER. I couldn't bring myself to go to a doctor. I finally went about 3 weeks later. And at that point, they couldn't do any kind of evidence collection, but I needed to make sure that I hadn't been given anything. And I had just walked in my front door, just gotten home, when my phone rang, and it was the doctor. And I knew that if she was calling me, it was something very serious, and I mean, my heart stopped. And that is when she told me that I was pregnant. And obviously it had resulted from that. Like, the medication that I had gotten did not work. I think I dropped like a stone to the floor, just sobbing and sobbing. I think I scared the doctor. I had just found out that I was expecting a child after I was assaulted by a man. I really want you guys to understand how that feels. I had just survived a vicious attack on my body, and I almost didn't survive. I hadn't been diagnosed with PTSD yet, but I certainly had it. I was jobless, and there was a monster illness that nobody knew anything about that was completely shutting the world down. Up until that point, I had never felt fear like that in my life. And keep in mind, I still considered myself an atheist at this point. So my doctor had called. She had told me I had hit the floor. I was having a complete breakdown. But I remember talking to my doctor and, no, I'm fine. I'll talk to you later. And I hung up the phone. And I immediately called my best friend, who is like a sister to me. And she knew what had happened to me. And I just said the words, I'm pregnant. And she knew I had no job, and she immediately said, I will pay for it. You don't have to go through this. I'm going to pay for it. We will make an appointment right now. And I was and am very pro-choice. And at that point in time, I was seriously considering being child-free for my life. And yet, somehow, when she said those words, something incredible happened. It was like a hand on my chest. Not in an unpleasant way, but firm and unmoving, just pressure. And then it was just like weight spread through my entire body, like I had turned to stone. But not, again, not in an unpleasant way, like as if somebody wrapped you in a weighted blanket. And I heard quite distinctly a very soft, very firm voice in my head. And the voice said, "You will have this baby will live, and you will love him." And with that, an absolute certainty just spread through my body, like a light. Like if the first feeling was like stone, the second feeling was like a light. And I told my friend, no, I'm keeping it. And you need to know the level of shock that everybody had over me making that decision. Because I was not the girl who would make that decision. But from that very first day, that very first moment, I was absolutely certain. And I have never once wavered in that certainty. And at this point, I want to jump in and say that I struggled with sharing this story publicly because this is not just my story, this is my son's story. And I want to say to anybody who hears or spreads this story, my son cannot help where he came from. My own father is a terrible person. So many people have fathers who are terrible people. I won't even insult the person who did this publicly because my son has a genetic link to that person. And whatever terrible decisions he made, many of us are capable of terrible decisions in the right circumstances. So what I'm saying is be respectful of my child. We can move on with the story now. I managed to get a job. I managed to get housing. And for a while, it seemed like things were going to get better. I got into therapy, but I was alone. I was pregnant. I'm crying again. It's hard going through that by yourself. I mean, my family supported me, but when I went home to an empty house. So anyway, I was terrified to have this baby in a hospital. Not just because of this insane virus that was going around, but because I was so scared that I would end up with a male doctor or a male nurse or a male anything when I went into labor. Because you see, for months, I could not be touched by men. I couldn't be alone in a room with a man. I mean, even my stepfather, I'm shaking thinking about it because I'm putting myself back into the story. Even my own stepfather giving me a hug, I would cringe. So I tried to go through a local birth center. All female midwives, a homey, natural environment. Because you see, I was also terrified to be medicated against my will because of what had happened when I was assaulted. I was so scared of anything being done against my will. And I thought, if I can have this baby naturally and surrounded by women, none of that'll happen and it'll be fine. Wow. I was 2 weeks past my due date. I went into labor on a Friday night at 7:30. My mom came over and stayed the night with me. My labor progressed very slowly, and you aren't supposed to go into the birth center until your contractions are like 2 to 3 minutes apart. It finally got there the next day. I don't even remember what time, but it was in the afternoon. And so we went to the birth center, and the nurse that was on call was not my favorite nurse who was there. And she immediately decided that I was being dramatic. In the politest terms possible, she checked me, and it was terrible. And deeply, 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 deeply upset me. I mean, I went into hysterics. And the birth center knew my history. So that was to be expected. And I remember even calming down and wiping my tears and apologizing to her and just saying, I'm sorry, it's a physical reaction. I can't control it. But from that moment on, she just treated me like I was a dramatic nuisance. Things progressed. I'd been in labor for over 24 hours. And I started to feel like something was wrong. I was having pain that I had not been told to expect. I was having back labor really badly, which I know does happen, but I was also starting to get a very sharp pain in my hip. And even my mom mentioned to the midwife, when she contracts, it looks like the baby is diagonal. Are you sure that he's head down? She said, yes, he's head down. I told her, I feel like something's wrong. My heart is racing. There's a sharp pain. She was on her phone. She was on her phone the whole time, and she barely glances up from her phone and looks at me and says, yeah, well, labor hurts. It got to a point where I completely could not cope. I was screaming. I was fainting. They had a bed, and I was laying on it with my mother, just clinging to her. And I would pass out, and I would come to scream, and then I would pass out again. And the contractions did not have a break between them. It was like one long, like they would peak and come down a little bit and then immediately peak again. And the torment of that. I have never felt pain like that. So my mom and my aunt were getting extremely frustrated with the nurse and her lack of action. And when, isn't there something you can give her? She said she could give me pain medicine. Didn't tell us what it was. You know what they said George Floyd was on? It starts with an F. She injected me with that without telling me what it was. Now, that is permissible as a pain relief in labor, but only when the baby is very close to being born, because it is extremely dangerous for both the mother and the baby. And at that point, I completely lost my ability to cope whatsoever, because once again, I was paralyzed. It did nothing for the pain. My mom says that I just went limp, but I was still screaming. So, alhamdulillah, she and my aunt made the decision to take me to the hospital. I had been promised that this birth center would call an ambulance in the event of an emergency. The nurse did not. My mother and my aunt had to half carry, half drag me to my mother's truck, and my mother drove me to the hospital. The nurse called ahead and told the hospital that I had only been in labor for 12 hours. When I arrived there, I had been in labor for 30. They checked me. They found that I had not progressed at all, which after 30 hours of labor is an extremely concerning thing. But I digress. Once again, I almost lost my life, and my child almost lost his. They had 2 IVs going into me at the same time because I was so dehydrated, and I remember a doctor screaming at the nurses that it wasn't enough and that they needed to hang more fluid. I watched my blood pressure drop to 26/47. I am not a healthcare professional, but I'm told that's bad. I heard my son's heart rate on the monitor going boop, boop, boop. And they rushed me into an emergency C-section, which is a trauma in and of itself. They tear your clothes from you. They throw you onto a table, bright lights, people everywhere. You can't move, and you're awake, and you can feel all this pulling and tugging. And my son was so severely stuck in my hip that my body was doing this from them trying to get him out. When he came out, he wouldn't breathe. They held him up for me, and he was so dark purple, he was almost black. I didn't hear him cry, and they immediately took him from me. And at that point, I went under. I don't know if I fainted or if they put me on, or if I was about to lose my life. I don't know. But I saw, it was just a kaleidoscope of color. It was like flying into the sun. And I screamed out for that voice that I had heard when I first found out I was pregnant. I screamed at the voice and I said, "You told me my baby would live." And in that moment, I was just enveloped in this energy of light and love and peace. And I just felt in my bones, it's going to be okay. Your baby will live. And then I woke up in a recovery room. Anyway, so after my son was born, I pretty much immediately went back to work. I think I got like 3 weeks off because that was all the PTO I had accrued. And so I was just thrown into being a full-time single mom, working full-time. I was trying to get a master's degree because I wanted to better our situation, you know. And it was an incredibly lonely and difficult time of my life. And, you know, I had PTSD from now not 1 but 2 events. I had severe, severe postpartum anxiety with intense, intrusive thoughts about my son and his safety. And it was terrible. Like, one of my biggest regrets is that I don't really have a lot of memories of my son during that time period because I was just so broken and so angry and so lonely. And even, you know, I thought about deleting old videos on this page, and I deleted some, but I left some up because I'm not ashamed of my journey, you know? But I think watching back some of my old videos, I honestly think I can see the pain and the rage in them. Like, I just was so torn up, and I worked so hard on trying to heal, but it seemed like we just had the worst luck in the world. Like, it felt like we were being targeted by a demon or something. Like, bad things were just happening to us constantly, like terrible health issues, getting sick constantly. And it just seemed like every other week something at my house was breaking down, some kind of crisis was going on. I mean, people that know me, people at my work would literally just be like, "Did you rob a graveyard? Like, what is happening? Like, why do so many bad things happen to you?" And I was just like, I don't know. And that was when I started praying again. Like, I was so scared for my son's safety, but I was also just so overwhelmed and stressed and just falling apart, you know, and lonely. And I didn't even know who to pray to. I was leaving honey out for the fairies, you know. People in my spiritual groups would say things like, oh, a deity will call to you. So I tried praying to Gaia, to Hecate, to, I forgot what the other one's name is. I'm sorry. Anyway, and I always just felt like I was praying to stone. But I felt this spiritual pull, but it just seemed like I was missing it. I was missing something. So I don't even know where to go from here. I tried so hard to just heal, like focus on my healing, focus on loving myself, focus on loving my child. And I feel like over time I was doing okay, you know, I was doing okay with that, but there was something missing. There was a hole in my chest, a hole in my heart. And we, through a weird twist of fate that wasn't really by choice or anything like that, we ended up joining this community that was like 99% Muslim. And I'm not going to get more specific than that because I just feel like people have too much information and it's easy to find people, you know. So I was so ready to be judged by this community, or that they were going to try to convert me or whatever, because that was my only experience with a religious community, right? And they didn't. All they did was like shower me with love. Nobody even once was like, would you like to read the Quran? Never. Oh, you should come to the mosque with me. Nope. Nothing like that. Nothing like that. I mean, they'd give us gifts for, is it Ramadan or Eid that we get gifts? I don't know, actually. But they would give us gifts and things like that. And that was it. That was it. They were so loving and kind. And so a curiosity was sparked. And I was very drawn to this community. But I don't know. I think I just refused to even believe that the divine experiences that I had been having, that this massive energy that I had become aware of that was connecting me to everybody and to everything, I think I just refused to believe that could possibly be Allah. I don't know. So, in the last several months, things had really kicked up in terms of bad luck, and it's been hellish. It has been horrible. My job has been horrible. Finances have been horrible. Obviously, inflation is horrible for everyone. I've been through a lot with my family. I've lost family members, not through but big arguments and cutting people off and toxicity and things like that. And then in the month before October, so September, within a month, I had 2 giant floods at my house, which is a freak of nature because this is not an area that floods. And one of them, it was like this massive rainstorm that water just flowed into the house. And the second one was my washing machine just inexplicably broke and flooded the entire house, and it was horrible. And so when I've talked about things like having really serious financial difficulties right now, it's because of that. I had to replace my floors, I had to replace the washing machine, all of this stuff that I can't do, you know? And even though I had done so much healing and so much work on myself to get through my PTSD, to get through my anxiety, to get through all of these things, I was just feeling broken again. It was just why can't my life be good? You know? And ooh, I teared up a little bit there. And it was also just so lonely. The last 3 years have been so lonely. Being a single parent, and especially being a single mom, because moms are just judged more than dads. That's just a thing. And being a single mom, the way that I became a single mom, is one of the loneliest experiences I've ever been through. And I think my heart was just crying out for can something love me? Don't I deserve love? And I mean, obviously my son does, my mom does, my sister does, but not in the way of you want to feel important and special and valued in this life, you know? So anyway, sorry. Whoa. When everything started happening with Palestine, I just got filled with this drive to help as much as I could. And so I was staying up all night, watching all of these updates, watching all of these videos, just trying to bear witness to these people and everything that they're going through. And I was astounded by their faith and just astounded by their beauty. And that is what made me finally pick up the Quran. And as I was reading it, it just felt like home. It just felt like everything that I've ever questioned, everything that I've ever thought, everything that I was kind of building myself in my head about this is what I think the universe is, was in there. And it was incredible. And that was the point when I posted my Crisis of Faith video, because my brain was dealing with serious cognitive dissonance, because it was like, okay, but I'm an atheist. Okay, but I'm an atheist. Like, I couldn't get there, you know? And then the love that the community just outpoured toward me, that's what finally pushed me to, you know, I prayed and I asked for a sign. And then I went to a woman who's a leader in the community and spoke with her, and she just burst into tears and gave me a hug. And the moment that she hugged me, that was it. And that feeling that I had when my son was born, not when my son was born, that feeling that I had when my friend offered to help me get rid of my pregnancy, happened again. It just felt like I was being embraced by light. And I heard a small voice in my head, a small, very firm voice that just said, this is your path. And I just knew in that moment, this is the right way. This is the path for me. This is where I'm meant to be. And the peace that has filled me since then is incredible. And the feeling of love and belonging is just incredible. And, you know, people have asked me, how can you know, why Islam? Why Islam of all things? And I tell them, nothing short of divine intervention would have ever gotten me to believe in a God again. And I feel very seriously and very clearly that that is what I have experienced, is divine intervention. So yeah, that's the story. There's a lot of feelings, but I know that I'm where I'm meant to be now. Thank you all for listening.